21st meeting of the Issaquah Transportation Advisory Board. And if we don't approve agendas, so the first item, oh yeah, so my name is Cynthia Kress and I'm the Vice Chair of the Transportation Advisory Board and the chair for this evening, or at least so far. The first item on the agenda after call to order is approval of the minutes. Did everyone have a chance to review the minutes? If everyone's comfortable, I would entertain a motion to approve both minutes. Can we do them in one motion?
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
On simple things like this, I'll just say anyone opposed and going once, going twice. Okay, so minutes are approved. If it's a more substantive issue, I'll probably make sure that we hear from everybody, but I don't think we're doing anything like that anytime soon. So third on the agenda is public comment. I don't see anybody, but I don't want to make any assumptions. Is anyone here to make public comment tonight?
I don't see anyone else calling in tonight.
Okay, so that brings us to item 4A, regular business. Stephen prepared, sent some suggested comments. Shall I just, would that be my turn to go next, Stephen, or do you want to jump in first?
No, go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay, so I guess this isn't in the script, but I am sticking to the script pretty much. But so Nina Million was our chair. I'm acting as the chair tonight as the vice chair, but the board, this new board, I mean, actually, I'm not really sure when we're supposed to be picking the chair and vice chair, but we're late in the cycle, so we would be doing it again in May. But so in a way, this is a good practice run. So they gave a sample script. So I guess the following process will be used to elect officers. First, I'll call for nominations, and when all the nominations have been made, I will close the nominations, and then we would vote. So the board members would be provided an opportunity to discuss, and then people would vote, and then we would move to the vice chair. So first I will, unless Stephen has any course correction, I will at this time call for nominations for the chair.
I nominate Cynthia for chair.
Thank you. Are there any other nominations for chair? Okay, so now the board members are provided an opportunity to discuss if only one nomination is made, the member is considered elected by the position by unanimous consent. There was a little blurb that I wrote in the nomination. I think the only thing I just want to comment on real quick is that I think it's really important for this process. I think 2/3 of the board is brand new. And so this went along a little more of a default, but I want to make sure that everybody feels like anybody who wants to serve in this role, that, you know, this is not something that gets decided just necessarily by staff or is any kind of default. We just, yeah. So I appreciate the nomination and I accept. And since there's no other nominations, I'll make last call for other nominations, and then the procedure is in that since I accept the nomination, then I would be deemed the chair. Last call. Any other nominations for chair? Okay. Yay, thank you. I'll be happy to serve as your chair. The next thing, we would do the same process then for vice chair. The vice chair serves in the event that the chair is unable. And when I was vice chair, I kind of went along with the meetings with staff with Nina, and that made it easy. And certainly, I think in her second meeting, I had to serve as the chair for the evening because she was on a trip. So good chance that vice chair will be called upon to run the meeting. So now I will call for nominations.
This is Tom, and I would nominate Sujata. Well,
I was planning on also nominating Sujata Goyal. Any other nominations for vice chair? All right, well, Sujata, did you want to make any comments before we just declare it so, being that there's no other nominations? Or maybe we give one last call for the second nomination?
Thank you for nominating me. I appreciate that. And the nice thing is, as Cynthia mentioned, that this is something we'll be chair and vice chair till May. So as the new members are onboarding, we'll have another opportunity if people are, as you're getting your feet wet and more interested and passionate about what the board is up to, then in May, there'll be that, opportunity again to maybe nominate yourself or nominate others who could be a good fit for these roles as well. So.
All right, last call for another nomination for vice chair. All right, seeing none, hearing none, I'm going to close that, and then Sujata is therefore named. She's considered elected to the position by unanimous consent. And I think that concludes the chair selection of chair and vice chair. Stephen, did I miss anything? Cool.
No, I think you covered it all.
All right.
Good, nice job. Congratulations to you both.
Thanks. All right, so moving on then I'll continue then for this evening as then would I be then the chair starting this moment? Is this big transfer of power just happened? Okay. So moving on to adoption of the revised board rules and regulations. Those were, that's item 4B. Those were in your packet. I know we spent a little time with these when the board first formed roughly 2 years ago. I reread them today. I didn't see anything in there that I was interested in changing. But is there anybody that wants to talk about any provision in there? Did everyone have an opportunity to read them, and did anyone have any suggestions or questions that they want to discuss?
So I guess I'm not sure the procedure for speaking up. Should I be using the raise hand button? Is that something that we're trying to use, or just openly share?
I'm brand new as the chair. I don't know yet.
For comments and questions, just type in comment or question, and then chair, vice chair, or staff will kind of call people out as we see things. It helps us kind of keep track of who has a comment and when.
Oh, I just opened the comments. I will try to also remember to track comments. And I think it's really important to put just not the substance, but just that you have a comment or a question, because it becomes a little harder for everyone to track. You don't really want to leave substance in the chat. You want everybody to be hearing it real time. So I would definitely ask that people just put in that they have a question or a comment and not actually be putting those in the chat. I don't know if the city has a particular practice, but that's something I've noticed in some of these kinds of meetings, that it's important to keep everyone on the same page.
Yeah, no, that's correct. The main thing is that what goes into the chat, it doesn't get recorded and added to kind of the meeting minutes. So that's why we ask that you say your actual questions over the video.
So if nobody has any comments, I will entertain a motion to adopt the minute. The main change is just the meeting date. So that's why we had to even revisit this at all, if I remember correctly, Stephen. And I also know that just if you guys had read your November meeting minutes, you might notice that there was a member of the community that asked us to extend the public comment period to 5 minutes. But I personally think 3 minutes is more than enough time. It's a volunteer board. It's an advisory committee. We're not taking actions that bind council. So I think 3 minutes. Lots of other agencies have 2 minutes. So I personally thought 3 minutes. So I noticed it hadn't been suggested that we change that, and I agree with that. But if there aren't any other questions or comments, I would entertain a motion to adopt.
Micah has a comment or question.
Thank you. Micah, go ahead.
So I'm assuming by the red text on the third Thursday, that's the only change from previous versions of this. And assuming that's true, has there been anything, you brought up the 5 minutes versus 3 minutes, has there been any other comments about this that have been looked at recently and a change made or not changed that we should specifically look for in here?
Even from the last time we looked at the rules and procedures, we didn't make much changes. We did look at participation, particularly the amount of time allowed for public comment, and even then the board settled on 3 minutes as being more than enough time for public comment. Other than that, the only other change that I think I'll be making is it says Public Works Engineering Department. We are now actually just Public Works. So it's just a very small, minor name change for our department.
Thank you.
And then Erica, I think you had a question.
Go ahead, Erica. You think she's not hearing us?
You might be on mute.
Erica is on mute.
She might not hear us, so I'm gonna ask her to type her question and then I'll read it out loud.
Okay.
Otherwise, do you want to solicit more comments or questions on the rules procedures?
Yeah, well, we're waiting for Erica to have a chance to say what's on her mind. Is there anyone else that has any questions or? Oh, Joseph, go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, this is just a small question. It might actually be a dumb question, but it says here in section 10 that the order of business, part of it is approval of minutes. What exactly is like the purpose of the approval of minutes part?
Stephen, I'll let you take that one if you want.
Could you repeat the last part of your question, Joseph?
Yeah, just essentially like what's the purpose for the approval of minutes?
Just because we have to have a record, an official record of what was discussed at our meetings. Following each meeting, I have to report out on what was typed in or what was discussed in each of our boards. Even though these meetings are recorded and posted, it's nice to have a brief summary available for anyone who just wants to briefly just read through what was discussed or feedback that was provided by the board.
Okay.
And then there could be, the first draft could have a mistake in it. So let's say it said someone wasn't there, but they really were, or vice versa, or, something was overlooked. It just, because it does become part of the record, you just want everyone to have a chance to.
Right, and the other part is that we all agree to the meeting minutes and what was discussed at the last meeting, so there's no ambiguity going forward.
So, Erica.
Can you hear me all?
Yes. I think Erica is having.
Hi, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Erica. So Erica sent me a message. She had a clarifying question confirming whether or not we'll be continuing with the youth report. That was something that I was going to discuss kind of at the end after everybody had their comments and questions, but there is a question on whether or not we want to have the youth report added to the end of the agenda. That was a question I was going to pose to the board. The original intent of having the youth report on there was to allow our youth members to report out on any activities that might be going on in the community that we wouldn't hear otherwise about. But it is something that we haven't had much luck about getting much youth report out, and hearing from previous youth members that it may be helpful if the youth members were participating on other boards, but typically they don't in our community. So it's suggested that we potentially remove it and just have our board work plan kind of replace its place on the end of the agenda. Joseph, Alec, do you two have any thoughts on that?
I don't necessarily have any opinion on that. I am on some other boards, like the Issaquah Youth Advisory Board, but I don't necessarily have an opinion on like keeping it essentially.
Okay.
Stephen, I'm confused. Currently, does it say, can you remind me, I did read through these, but is the youth report in the document that we're considering at this time?
No, that's why I was going to ask afterward.
In other words, do we want to add it to this? Well, I guess I'm confused why you want to talk about that afterwards, because we're just about to adopt. Do we not have to adopt? Yeah, it's adoption of the revised board rules and regulations. Wouldn't we want to finish revising it and adopt it once and for all?
For the youth report, we don't actually have to list that in the rules and procedures. We just have to have
I
reports.
see.
Like right
So we
now,
can have more things, just not, that's the,
correct. Right now, the
This is
rules
the
and
order.
procedures just outline the order of things for our
so
agenda.
that would be under item F, other business and announcements.
Correct.
Got it. Gotcha. Well, how about if we table that youth report then till later? And I'm inclined to keep it until we're all sure with this new board that we don't want it. But I also don't want to put an onus on someone to prepare something if they're not thinking it has a lot of value. But let's go back to the business at hand, which is, are we interested? I would entertain a motion to adopt these rules as written. Is there anybody?
I'm motion to adopt the revised board rules and regulations.
I second it.
All right, all those in favor? Oh, wait, hold on. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, motion carries. And thank you, Joseph, for asking your question. And I am personally someone who doesn't think there's really any dumb questions. We're all coming at this with different experiences, different knowledge base. And if we are embarrassed to ask dumb questions, then I don't think we'll be as productive. So I appreciate you doing that. I always have lots of dumb questions. Sometimes I ask the same ones more than once. Okay, so moving on to item 4C, introduction of the Transportation Improvement Plan. I'm going to turn it over to John, and not Stephen, but John. Is that right? Okay, take it away, John. Hello. John, you're on mute.
I was the first one to do that tonight. Let me get my presentation loaded and we'll begin with it. There, content. PowerPoint. Okay, there. Okay, because I can't see the screen, is it showing you guys the PowerPoint and present? Okay, thanks, Tom. All right, good evening. I'm John Mortensen, the Transportation Engineering Manager, and tonight's presentation is an overview of the Transportation Improvement Program. It's got a lot of content, and so if you have a question, just feel free to go with the procedures and we'll stop wherever we're at and just take care of the questions as they come up. And so the first, we're going to cover a variety of things, including just a general overview of what is the Transportation Improvement Program and how it relates to other city plans such as the Mobility Master Plan, the Comprehensive Plan, and the Capital Improvement Plan. I'll talk a little bit about the projects that are included in the Transportation Improvement Program, as well as the funding that we use to support these projects, and talk about what the next steps will be going forward. The Transportation Improvement Program is a 6-year short-range planning document. It shows the transportation projects that the city will be working on over the next 6 years and identifies the funding for the different projects in it. It gets updated every year. The items that are required for our transportation improvement program are it needs to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. The city council is required to adopt it every year. The due date to adopt it is July 1st, and it gets adopted after a public hearing. And then once it's been adopted, the city has 30 days to file the transportation improvement program with the state secretary of transportation. Earlier, I mentioned that the TIP, or the transportation improvement program, needed to be consistent with the city's comprehensive plan. The cities like the Issaquah are required to have a comprehensive plan, and it's really establishes Issaquah's future and policy direction and guides the day-to-day decisions of the city. The city of Issaquah is required to have a comprehensive plan by the Growth Management Act. Issaquah's comprehensive plan has 9 elements, and the transportation element is one of the 9 elements. The Mobility Master Plan was a planning document for the city's transportation system and mobility in Issaquah. It was recently completed. The Mobility Master Plan has 4 chapters talking about the mobility system today and the future growth coming to the city, plan development, the goals and policies, and the plan implementation. The goals and policies from the Mobility Master Plan were recently, in last December, adopted or included in an update to the comprehensive plan, and they were added to the transportation element, or I should say replaced the transportation element in the comprehensive plan. The current phase for the Mobility Master Plan is the plan implementation. The other plan that the Transportation Improvement Program relates to is the city's CIP, or Capital Improvement Plan. And the simplest way to think about it is this: the Capital Improvement Plan has many chapters, and the Transportation Improvement Program is one of the chapters. Other chapters are for the different utilities like the water and sanitary sewer, capital facilities like our buildings, the city's parks, and other buildings, large technology infrastructure that the city has. And the Capital Improvement Plan is updated every 2 years. The Transportation Improvement Program is updated every year. And so that's one little difference. And so this year, the city is updating both the CIP and the TIP at the same time. And then next year, only the Transportation Improvement Program will be updated. And this page is just really a summary of what I was trying to explain, where the city prepared the Mobility Master Plan, and that went into the transportation element of the comprehensive plan, which then guides the Transportation Improvement Program, which then is included in the CIP. And at this point, I'll just pause for a little bit. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. So I mentioned the current phase is implementing the Mobility Master Plan. And there's different parts to it. And we're working on updating some of the city's standards and policies. At the end of 2020, the Transportation Advisory Board worked on the Complete Streets policy, and that will be going to the City Council pretty soon. Other policies and standards we're working on are the street standards, pedestrian crossing guidelines and traffic calming program. Another part of implementing the mobility master plan is incorporating the mobility master plan into the transportation improvement program. And how that is done was pretty well spelled out in the mobility master plan. It talked about how the city would continue projects that are currently underway and in progress, and at the same time look to pursue new priority projects based on the priorities established in the mobility master plan. There's a lot of different types of or projects that go into the transportation improvement program. And I mentioned that the mobility master plan said that projects that are currently underway will continue. The city also has projects that I decided to name mandated projects. There are projects that we just need to do in order to take care of our transportation system. And we also have projects that are annual projects that we do on an annual basis. And there is a lot of overlap between the annual projects and the mandated projects. A little bit later, I'll go over some examples of these different categories. And then there's also the new priority projects that we'll look to try and add to the transportation improvement program. This slide's got a list of the projects that are currently underway, and I'll just give you guys a brief description of these projects. There's more information in the most recent transportation improvement program. The first one is the intersection of 12th Avenue and SR 900 and 17th Avenue. That's the one where we've got the picture on the left here. And that is the third and final project from the Costco development agreement. The Costco development agreement was how the city widened the East Lake Sammamish Parkway from 56th to Issaquah Fall City Road and built the Southeast 62nd Street extension. And this project, the 12th and SR 900 project, will add a second left turn lane next to the Holiday Inn and a right turn lane and add more capacity to that intersection. The Newport Way SR 900 to 54th project is a project that will add pedestrian facilities between SR 900 and 54th, as well as bicycle facilities, and make intersection improvements at the intersections along the corridor. Newport Way Maple to Sunset is a very similar project to the other Newport Way project, where it's adding bike and pedestrian facilities to a section of Newport Way. It also will be adding a second southbound lane between Maple Street and 900 feet south of Holly Street, and 3 roundabouts at Juniper, Dogwood, and Holly. The Northwest Sammamish Road non-motorized. I see there's a question. I think this would be a good time to take it.
Okay, this is Jerry. When you say a project is underway, is it underway as design or is it going to be underway as construction? So what do you mean by a project being underway?
That's a great question. In terms of all these examples that are underway, they're all currently in design. But it could, if we had a project that had a multi-year construction that was underway, that one would also continue. But all these projects are currently in design. Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The Northwest Sammamish Road non-motorized improvements, that's a project that will add non-motorized facility between the neighborhood south of Lake Sammamish, sometimes referred to as South Cove, to the Lake Sammamish State Park. And then the streetscape project is one where the city's been, over the last probably about 4 years, been working on making some improvements to Front Street and eventually to Alder to make for a more inviting pedestrian gathering area. And then the final one is the Issaquah Highland signal pole painting project that will be, over the next several years, repainting the signal poles in the Highlands. The projects that I classified as annual projects, the ones that we work on every year, there's the ADA improvements project where the city will make upgrades to within the public right-of-way to improve disability access, things like building curb ramps that meet the requirements for ADA, or pedestrian push buttons that are audible and countdown pedestrian signal heads that will give the countdown to know how long you have to cross the intersection. The pavement management program that does a number of measures to take care of pavement in the city of Issaquah, whether it's repaving by doing an overlay, which is where they take a grinder and grind out some of the asphalt and put new asphalt down, or sealing up the cracks. And a new annual project that we just got started is the concrete maintenance program that will take care of tripping hazards and concrete that's in poor condition. And I see we got another question.
Yes, I have a question from Erica. How have the COVID-related holds on WashDOT projects affected these projects, if at all? And it might have been referring to the ongoing projects on the previous page.
Okay, yeah, let me go back to that one. The COVID stuff luckily has not impacted any of the projects underway. One of our projects, the 12th and SR 900, had some funding that was delayed, not because of COVID, but after the I-976 was passed. That was the car tab initiative. The state held on to some money that the city had for about half of a year before it was finally released, and that delayed the project. But I'm going to knock on wood, nothing COVID related has delayed any of our projects. And I think there's another question from David.
I think
We
you're
can't
on
hear
mute,
you, David.
Am I working?
Yep.
Okay, must have been the headphones. So just curious about the budgeting process on how that's formulated. On the split screen, it had what you're describing in your presentation, and then under it, it had the budget under it. Is it these projects have been approved and the budgets are built after, or do we have a set budget for the tip and then you have to work kind of your way within that?
That's a good question. Let me answer it a little bit later when I get to the funding part, and that'll help guide what I talk about when I get to the funding. I'll go into a few more details than I probably otherwise would have.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And then the final annual project is the Strategic Small Capital Project. And that's a new project that we have that came out of the city's strategic plan. And the idea of this project is to work on small improvements that make a big difference to the mobility system. And that was one of the objectives of the city's strategic plan. There's also number of mandated responsibilities that the city has. And most of the annual projects also fall into this category, but then I've got a few others that aren't annual projects that I want to talk about. And the first one is the retaining wall behind Fred Meyer on Black Nugget Road. And that is one where in a few years the city will need to replace it. And that's a project that we'll include into the tip. We've got a number of slow-moving landslides that we've been monitoring, and those could eventually become projects in the transportation improvement program. There is a landslide on Newport Way near the King County Trailhead that it'll be built during taken care of during 2021. So it won't be part of this tip process, but that's an example of a transportation improvement project that we just have to do because of a landslide. And with Issaquah's geography and rainfall, those come up. And then I put the Gilman Bridge on here. We currently do not have a project, but it's it's a pretty old bridge. It was built in 1940. And we have our bridges inspected on a frequent basis, but this year we're going to go ahead and do an update to the load rating calculations to determine if that bridge needs to be replaced at some time in the future, or if we need to make some modifications for seismic or scour with the creek down below with the fish. And so we're going to be looking at that bridge, and a project might come up with that bridge.
Is the Gilman Bridge, is that on Gilman Boulevard over this Creek?
Oh, yes, I should have explained that one better. Thanks, Tom. It is the bridge over Issaquah Creek on Gilman.
Hey, John, just a little history. That's the old Highway 10 bridge.
All right, excellent. All right, so David asked a good question about project funding, and we have a variety of funding for our projects. There's local funding that comes from the city of Issaquah, and then there's external funding that we have for our projects. And I showed this slide here because one of our funding partners, the Transportation Improvement Board, they have a couple funding programs where we try and get funding from. And they're a very blunt agency in telling people that they want projects that meet their criteria for projects. And same thing for other granting agencies. So a project that might be a priority for the city of Issaquah, and I think the best example is the Southeast 43rd signal. That one was a huge priority for the Providence Point neighborhood. However, it was a project that was a low priority for the different agencies who award grant funds. And so that's a project that the city funded itself. Now, there is a few times when it overlaps, like the two Newport Way projects, I think, would fall in the category of a project that would look good for the granting agencies as well as for the residents of Issaquah. And that's not to say that projects that aren't neighborhood projects that are grant projects, those do have tremendous value to the community, but they usually are more economic development driven and things like that, or they're on a busy corridor with lots of traffic. And then, so what we do we have to identify a funding source for these different projects, and we have a number of different funding sources. Like I mentioned, there's the grants, which the Transportation Improvement Board has grants. The Washington State Department of Transportation has some grants. We compete for grants through the Puget Sound Regional Council, and I won't go into all the details, but there's a number of buckets to compete for. And then in terms of city funding, we have funding through the real estate exercise tax when there's a real estate transaction that takes place. When there's a new development, the development has to pay traffic impact fees, which can go towards funding projects. They also pay pedestrian and bicycle mitigation fees that go towards pedestrian and bicycle projects. And then we also have the general fund as a potential for funding projects, as well as the ability to issue bonds and take on debt to build projects. And an example of that would be the Southeast 43rd Signal Project the City Council issued bonds for. And then the other way where the city can generate revenue for projects is to ask the voters to increase taxes, whether it's the sales tax or the property tax. But as part of this process, what we're going to do is identify the projects and look at our funding sources, and then it becomes a balancing act and a priority act of trying to put together the 6-year TIP. And David, did that answer your question well enough, or do you want me to clarify and add more detail, or?
No, I think that's makes sense. I just wanted to see if it was something like, if we have a pre-approved set amount of money and then we're trying to work within that, or we have some overage and then we have to go and figure out like how to go raise the rest of the money to get these things done.
Well, each of the funding sources that I had mentioned, and I'm just going to talk about the city of Issaquah's funding sources and ignore the grants, that there is a limited amount. So as part of the CIP process, the finance department is looking at how much money we have in our different funds, like the traffic impact or fees, the pedestrian mitigation. Another one I forgot to mention was the traffic safety fund, which is funded based on the speed camera on Second near the high school and middle school. But so they look at how much funding we have, and without having gotten into the details, chances are we will want to do much more than we have funds for.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and it was just interesting to see some. I'm looking at the future projects. Some are $1 million and some are $80 million, and so you have a very vast range of potential funding needs. So just curious on how that works. Thank you.
I wanted to sum up what I've been talking about. The Transportation Improvement Program, like I said, it's a short-range planning document. It needs to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. It consists of a variety of different projects, and as we fill out the Transportation Improvement Program, the first things that we will do is program in the mandated responsibilities, the annual projects, the ongoing projects, match the revenue with the expenses, and then start looking at what are the new priority projects that we can add to the TIP. And then the final thing is the city council gets to make the final decision. So once the TIP is put together, it'll go off, be reviewed internally by the finance department and the exec department, be presented to council, and they'll deliberate it and come up with the final version of what it looks like. And I saw there's another question.
I could go ahead.
Hi, John. So a question on the future years total, kind of building on what David said. Is there a way to see what the time frame is for that? And is everything that has any capital spending related to transportation in the CIP, the 6-year CIP, even if it has the majority of that spending in future years, or is there some sort of a cutoff for that?
In the past, when the city has put together the TIP, we've included both the future years and the projects in the next 6 years. And I was looking through the guidance for this current update, and it looks like we're just going to be programming the projects in the next 6 years, and then somewhere else we'll just have a list of future year projects and their cost estimates. And
Just
did I miss
to
part of
add
it,
on
or did I
to-
get all of it?
Just to add on to John's response, Micah, part of this process that we'll be going through this year is to be applying priorities or at least rankings to projects in the TIP that'll help us determine what will be coming up next. But beyond the 6 years, there isn't necessarily a timeline.
Okay, are there more questions? Okay. The next steps are at the tab meeting that I believe is now scheduled for February 4th. We'll talk about project prioritization, and then at the regular meeting on the 18th, talk about recommendations for the update to the transportation improvement program. And then from the tab's perspective, that's the point when the TIP process will go on pause. Things will go to, like I had mentioned, the finance department. We'll check, make sure we have the revenue for it, and then the administration and the mayor's office, and then finally to council. I believe it's going to be presented to council in April, and then I think on April 27th, the council is going to deliberate it, hold the public hearing, I believe May 3rd. I could be a little bit off on that one. And the plan is to have council adopt the CIP and the TIP at their meeting on May 17th. And then for the tab, we're going to come back to you in this summer and start talking about the scope of projects and see if we want to make any recommendations to update what's involved in a project and then these discussions will then be used for the TIP update process that'll take place a year from now. And that process is one that was part of the mobility master plan. And any other comments or questions?
This is Cynthia. I have a general question. In our packet, we received the document called the Transportation Improvement Plan. And I guess I'm just a little confused as to this, like the status of that versus, I'm just continue to be a little confused about the timing and the sequencing. So was this so I don't know what that spreadsheet is and how it compares to what we're going to be doing in the next 2 meetings.
So I believe that was the last year's TIP. And then we'll work on updating it. And so the projects that, like I mentioned, the currently updated, I guess to talk about what specifically the tab will be doing is after we've programmed in the ongoing projects, the mandated projects, the annual projects, then we're going to look at what capacity do we have for new priority projects. And those are the discussions that we'll be coming back to the tab with and looking at it from, so the MMP, the Mobility Master Plan, had the criteria that we use to evaluate projects, and we'll talk about, are there other things to consider, and talk about how to apply that and put the final touches on the TIP. Did that answer your question, Cynthia?
I think so. So we're going to be adopting one that's going to be shifted. Everything's going to be shifted left 1 year. So the first column will be 2022 through 2027. Yes. Okay. And so okay. And then my other general question about that is, I found it really helpful for you to describe the mandated, the projects underway, the annual projects and so forth. And then, but it would be helpful to know
Okay.
understand where we can be of most help, where can we be most helpful as an advisory board? What is discretionary, I guess. I want to, hopefully that will be really crystal clear so that we don't spend cycles, trying to evaluate something that we come to realize that was a mandated or an underway project, some kind of development agreement and so forth.
Okay, will do. Good idea.
So do we have more on this topic? Do you want to talk to us, Stephen, about how this is going to go forward? I'm still trying to wrap my head around what we're going to do exactly in the next couple of meetings.
Yeah, so I'll do that, and then on kind of the next agenda item, I just want to give everybody the opportunity to ask any general questions or have any comments about what they think or see in the TIP itself as it kind of stands now, just to help just to make sure everybody understands before we start making changes what it looks like now and how it was put together. I'm not seeing any questions or comments. So I think we can move on to that if that is what you want to do.
I know for me, as soon as we walk through the next agenda item, and then if you could tell us a little bit about how to prepare. I know you'll be sending out meeting, but it seems like very soon the rubber's going to kind of meet the road where we're going to have to take those priorities and compare them to actual projects. And that is, I think, a huge value to council to have this committee go through that in a really rigorous way. But it's also going to be a heavy lift for the individuals on the board. And I'm hoping that we can be real clear about where to focus our efforts and have a robust discussion. So leave it at that.
Okay, so I can move on to kind of the next parts and then kind of walk through how we'll have those discussions at the next meeting, if that's helpful. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen.
And thank you, John. That was really helpful.
Thank you.
So for some of you, this is going to be a little more of a reminder, but for most of you, this might be a little more new information. I'm going to explain the background on kind of the mobility master plan and the guiding principles to help explain the project priorities and how they were put together. The intent really is to look at every aspect of the transportation system with these principles in mind. One of the initial uses with the principles is to build them into the project evaluation process for the TIP, the process that we're kind of going through right now. So on the other attachment, setting the priorities, the project team and the board assembled criteria to evaluate the projects. And then for this meeting, I'll kind of cover the points allocated for those priorities and to make sure everybody understands how we want to use these priorities before we start kind of looking at the full evaluation for the TIP. Now for the project prioritization, the first section really is coming from the, just to help explain, the sections in the guiding principles are coming directly from the guiding principles. These 6, or at least 5 principles are being shown in the priorities, project priority categories. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. So for the first section, improve mobility within Issaquah, 22 points are allocated to this. And this is really looking at safety as well as access to the options for diverse community members. But it also looks at the likelihood of implementation of projects sooner rather than later and prioritizing those projects and allocating points. For the next section, there's an allocation of 16 points. And for this, preparing for growth, it's looking at applying multimodal capacity in projects and addressing the gaps in the system, as well as considering negative impacts on neighborhoods to make sure that we're minimizing any type of negative impacts on our neighborhoods through our projects, and increasing motorized capacity more towards the arterial roadways. The next section after that is really looking at better connecting Issaquah with the region. And so transit is a big component of how the points are being allocated. And it considers existing city investments into those type of projects and looks at connections to our growth centers. One of the major criteria and evaluations for grants is really how much we are prioritizing our growth centers. And so we want to make sure in the design and our own evaluations of projects that we're taking that into consideration. For the next section, it's more about the environmental sustainability of our projects, and we want to reward projects that are providing sustainable choices that are protecting or at least minimizing the impacts on the environment, particularly the sensitive areas in our community. And then this also considers overlap with the parks plan that also looks at environmental improvements throughout the city. And then lastly, it's the investment, looking at wise investment. It considers overlap with other city plans, making sure that we're being efficient with where we are prioritizing our investments. And it also evaluates the potential to use local funding so that we can implement projects sooner to really push on more short-term projects more than dedicating the majority of our time to long-term projects that take 20, 30 years to implement. But it also considers maintenance as a major component of how we want to design and prioritize our projects. In total, there's 74 points. For those that may have noticed, we don't have an anticipate transformation section built into the criteria. And the reason for that is when the project team was initially putting this together, we found that there was a lot of overlap with all the other sections. And so we didn't want to give double points for a lot of the same criteria. And so instead, we reallocated some of those points towards other sections. And so safety and access to the system actually was given more points when we finalized this criteria last year. And now I'm going to speak to process to help kind of answer some of your questions. Can everybody see my slides? Okay. This is kind of how our TIP process looks right now. What we typically do is we take the previous TIP, which contains all the projects that John kind of spoke to, identified as kind of the committed projects, near-term projects, and future projects that don't necessarily have a timeline. And then we applied funding availability or looked at funding availability, staff capacity, and then kind of applied project scheduling along with city council feedback for the next 6 years. And that is what really committed to how we developed our TIP or our CIP every year. And one thing to note is the CIP and the TIP, they're planning documents. Even though we're going through this formal process to develop and really plan out how we are wanting to implement our projects for transportation system, when these are approved, this doesn't decide on the final dollars. This helps inform the city budget process that the city council does at the end of every year. So just so it's clear, it's the whole city budget process where the money actually gets allocated. That's done through a separate process. This is just helping city council with the planning aspect of it all. The process that we're going to be going through now is pulling previous TIP, or at least taking the project list and the priorities from the mobility master plan and applying those two things together. And so that instead of starting with just the previous list that we had from the previous last year and changing dates and funding allocation for them, we're looking at more of a prioritized list, and then looking at funding availability and staffing capacity, as well as city council feedback and scheduling. The question we have for all of you right now is there something else that we should be considering in this development of the TIP? And I bring up this question now because there's major topics that were discussed in the development of the mobility master plan that aren't necessarily highlighted in this this prioritized list of the TIP. Right now, we have individual projects identified for sidewalk gaps that are more of a bucket of all of the gaps in the sidewalk or the pedestrian system and the bicycle system that are basically one bucket of filling a lot of the gaps in this system. These were identified as major issues in our transportation system by the Transportation Advisory Board over the last year when we were looking at the system-wide design and how we want to build out our future multimodal system. Another major item that's not really seen or it's not really prioritized is that we find medium-sized projects that are actually considered high priority in the city are more of kind of the middle or to the bottom of the list. And so how do we address these high priority projects that are somewhat underway, or at least are wanting to be done sooner rather than later, but don't necessarily get prioritized by the mobility master plan? And lastly, one of the big components of the mobility master plan that was discussed by the board was applying an equity lens. Now, right now, through the priorities, I think the second category, equity is considered in terms of access to the transportation system, but that's about it. And through the training that staff has gone through, we know that we can apply a separate lens to this to make sure that we are considering the access to the system more comprehensively and more holistically as we are implementing these projects. And so the question that we have for the board is, as you're looking at this list, the prioritized list from the mobility master plan, are the things that we talked about or things that you're kind of important to you, are they being highlighted near the top of the list? And I'll check now if there are any questions before I finish up.
Hi, Stephen. I have a question. Could you share what some of the priority medium-sized projects are that maybe might not currently be considered?
We will at our next meeting, actually. But one example that I can give is up in Highlands is the Central Park intersection improvements. That's a project that is a priority for the city because we want to make sure that we're maximizing kind of the improvements that were made to the park up in Highlands. But in terms of meeting a lot of the criteria that are defined by the guiding principles, it doesn't necessarily rank very high on our list. And so those type of projects are the ones that we need to try to consider, because these are the things that the board did discuss, but it's not necessarily rising to the top of the list as I think the board might have been hoping for. And so the question is, when we put together the TIP, is there another lens or another set of criteria that we need to be applying? Because really, what the criteria coming from the mobility master plan tells us is how well projects meet the guiding principles. How well does it address a lot of these goals that we kind of see from the guiding principles? Are there any other questions? Maybe even comments?
Stephen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can. That's great. It took me half the meeting, but where does I know the MMP is like future forecasting, but like preservation and maintenance or maybe like longevity, is that, where do you see that kind of lens rolling into things?
So I'll stop sharing my screen really quick. The preservation of our infrastructure and maintenance is captured in, I think, the last category of the criteria. I think there's an allocation of about 4 points in the criteria right now. Otherwise, the preservation and maintenance is something that we're trying to build into project design now, and kind of our own city processes, beyond just the build out of the TIP itself. Something that was identified as a big priority in the mobility master plan development.
Mike, I have a question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi. So in the project priorities section 1.3, there's points for within the next 6 years, but it's like an all or nothing thing where I was expecting to see maybe more points or some extra points for within the next 3 years or 2 years, whatever sort of that mid-range thing is. And I'm wondering whether if we were to have extra points there, would that address some of these medium, or is medium really not just a time thing, but more a overall project size?
Medium was more of project size, so it's not the 10 to 30 million dollar projects that you saw on the list. It's more of the couple million that you saw on the list. Something that's not easily implemented through just our own local funding, but something that's not necessarily a huge project that we see taking 20 years to build out.
Stephen, I have a question. So this might kind of be a dumb question because I worked on the MMP, but what I'm curious about, I think I know the answer, but I still think it's worth asking and being crystal clear. These project prioritization criteria and the points, I remember working on this, and I remember how much, we had a good rationale, we had really good discussions about it. My question is this embedded in the MMP, and is it already adopted, and therefore is it already established and not subject to revision or suggested revision? Because I think some of what you're asking by having that on that slide where you had 4 things, and taking out the equity lens, the first 3 things would suggest that maybe if we can't find it in there, or if it's not weighted high enough in there, then maybe we made a mistake. And I'm curious whether that thing is already adopted and we have to live with it, at least for the time being, but we may layer through discussion some other priorities, or is that thing malleable? And so again, it's a dumb question because I worked on the thing, but I can't remember if that text is actually in the adopted plan.
Yeah, I would say I wouldn't think that we made a mistake. It may be something new that's come up to add to it.
Sure. Oh, okay. But I meant the point is for now, we're 6 months ago, could it be improved? Or is that even an option? And again, that may be a dumb question, but I think it would be useful to know.
So this was not officially adopted with the transportation element update because we're wanting this to be more of part of the implementation side, so it's a little more malleable. But at the same time, over the course of last year, we made a lot of changes to kind of accommodate some of those issues that I'm kind of bringing up now, but a lot of the issues that we discussed over the last year as well. And there's not a whole lot you can make a change to really fix that, at least within this criteria, which is why we're bringing up the question, should we be adding another layer for the TIP, just the TIP itself? Because what this criteria is really telling us is how well each of the projects are meeting the guiding principles or implementing what we're wanting out of our transportation system. It's not necessarily trying to meet one of those considerations that was kind of listed on the other slide. So that's kind of why we're asking this question separate from the development of the criteria. Yes, we can make changes to it, but we don't think it's going to make a huge difference in terms of trying to bring up a lot of those issues that, in terms of how do we bring up the gaps in the walking or biking system as high priority projects. Maybe the recommendation there isn't necessarily just bring them to the top list, or maybe the recommendation is to the city council, maybe there's a discussion on having a separate program for those expansion and not having them identified as projects in the tip. That's kind of the discussion that we're trying to have is there another way that we can prioritize what the board is wanting as part of the tip process or separate from the tip process?
I'm sorry, I'm still a little confused because I'm looking at those priorities, and for example, number 1.2, you get 6 points if it closes a gap. So I'm not seeing that as being outside of that.
It's not necessarily that it's outside of it, it's that when you start pulling points or adding points to some of those systems, it takes away from the priority from other things that the board identified as high priorities. Like safety was one of those items that was identified as high priority, which is why it gets the highest allocation of points. And when you start putting more towards the other sections, it pulls away from that. And if you just try to add to the total points for the whole criteria, it kind of takes away from the objective nature of the criteria itself. So you want to try to keep to it as much as possible, but that way we're keeping to the priorities that the board had discussed. Does that make sense?
Sort of, but I'm being really linear in the way I'm thinking about it. If it doesn't pop, that means we had that it. Yeah,
But
I'm
yeah,
curious what
I-
others think.
Yeah, but I think, Cynthia, also the intent behind that and the way we did the variation of the points was, and I think I learn better by doing. And so I think maybe at the next meeting, when we actually have a list of projects and then we go through and, filter them through, we'll get a sense of how they weigh out. But I think the idea is, the county has, or not the county, but the city has hundreds and millions of dollars worth of transportation priorities. I mean, I could name, 3 million in my neighborhood alone of transportation priorities. And as we're sort of running them through the system, it sort of helps balance, hopefully all, and sort of based on these values, based on these priorities and the numbers we assign, it helps sort of define, okay, this is what rises to the top, and this is sort of, how we have to make adjustments. If we are saying this is our stated priority and we gave it the most weight, then that's what's going to rise to the top. And I'm assuming there's this opportunity at the end when you lay out all your cards on the table and you can decide, like, is this really the outcome we wanted based on the values and the guiding principles we have? Or did something happen in our math? So hopefully there's that opportunity to check back and make sure that the output looks like, what our function was supposed to look like, but just in case, but the idea really was that those numbers were supposed to reflect the values, and ultimately what comes out the end is supposed to be what we would have prioritized. But I totally get, I'm like, okay, if we run it through this and it doesn't look the way we wanted it, I mean, the way we had anticipated, is there maybe a check back loop or something?
Yeah, and that was kind of the intention of this meeting, is to help. I mean, we have a lot of new members. I want to make sure everybody understands what this is and how it was put together before we have that discussion of, okay, what needs to change. And I mean, I've worked with several different TIPs, and there's always this question of, when you get to this list that you now are scheduling for 6 years and out, is this really the priorities? Is this really meeting the priorities for the city? And if it's not, where does the change need to happen? And it typically isn't in this, initial criteria. It's built into the system of the TIP itself that we really need to look into. And so that's kind of where we're hoping to take this discussion at our next meeting. But at least for this meeting, I want to make sure everybody understands what this is first.
Yeah, and so I would just reiterate, as someone who sort of sat through this process, essentially what these numbers and charts and everything try to get at is we had this set of stated values of what we anticipated our transportation infrastructure should look like. And then we tried to attach some numbers to it in hopes that if you ran your projects through these, numbers and charts, you'd get some sort of objective outcome. But ultimately, that objective outcome should align with our stated values. So it's going to be a grand experiment for everybody to see if the system or process we put in place actually reaches the outcome that we had anticipated and actually reflects the values of the board. So, fingers crossed.
So, I'm thinking that this might be a good time in the meeting to just go around. Something I want to get us comfortable with is hearing from everybody. And so, Sujata and I have been doing most of the comments and questions. And if you guys don't mind, and we're doing fairly well on time, I'd like to just call on each person, and then you can pass if you want to, but I just kind of want to make sure we're hearing, everyone's getting an opportunity to talk. So I'm going to go in the order on my screen, which may or may not match yours. David, do you have any questions or comments?
What I say is me, David. There's two Davids on the
Oh, I'm
phone.
sorry.
So
There are David Wagner, David Holtzberg. Okay, sorry about that.
I'll go ahead though. I don't have any questions or comments. Like I said, I read everything before, and was just curious on the prioritization and the budgeting. But I think I'm pretty good right now.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to the next David, the other David Wagner. And if I say your name incorrectly, will you please correct me? Thank you.
You said the name right, and I'm still really learning on all of this. A lot of information to digest, but I feel comfortable with getting there. Just going to take me some time.
Erica, how's your audio? Can you tell us what's on your mind?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. Since the tip is supposed to be, it lays out projects for the next couple of years. I just don't know how in the weeds on things I can get, but I know one of the projects more towards the bottom of the list is the light pole, repainting a couple of different traffic poles in the Highlands. And I at the bottom paragraph of that, it says it would be a really big traffic inconvenience, and that's what I think is driving up the cost of it as well. In this point scoring system, is there any kind of almost negative points for things like that? I don't know, that was a thought that crossed my mind. If it's going to be a real inconvenience for something that my initial read, I think this is wrong. My initial read is, oh, it's just aesthetic appearance. But I'm sure it's much more than that. And it's actually for, if we don't take care of this, it'll cost us more in the long run. But I don't know if there's any thought given to almost a negative scoring.
It's not so much a negative scoring that's built into how we're evaluating projects. It's more about capacity and scheduling. So for projects that have kind of a negative impact on traffic congestion, we try to strategically schedule that or around where we have enough staff capacity to be able to support it. but at the same time where, it's the time of year, with our seasonality, traffic isn't the same throughout the year. So we try to pick a time where it's a kind of a minimal impact on the community as well. So for something that may be low cost, but it's actually pushed out a few years, that's kind of part of the consideration why it's pushed out a few years, is because we want to make sure we're picking a time where we don't have too many projects in the same area. We have staff capacity to support it, and the community is kind of at a good place where it's not having as much of an impact.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Can I follow up? Since the pandemic has shifted traffic patterns and things, and the one specific, it's actually the one in the picture that I'm thinking of, where that is just like a two-way big median in it. There was actually a crash there recently that was like, it just kind of backed things up. If one of those lanes is closed, that has like big impacts for like all the streets going off there. Is there any thought? I also don't know how shovel ready or paintbrush ready things like this would be, but kind of taking advantage of like traffic being a bit calmer now, maybe not for the city, but just in general, like to bump things up. I know that's not a continual thing because some of that's going to return once people stop working from home as much, but sorry, that's not a very clear question. I just rambled there.
No, I think what you're getting at is kind of the impact of the pandemic on the system itself, and if that's kind of opened any opportunities for us. Is that kind of where your question was going?
Yeah.
I'll start with an answer, and then I'll maybe ask John to kind of chime in too, because he knows more about a lot of the operation projects going on than I do. But when we are looking at impacts of the pandemic and how it's changed kind of the travel behavior, it has opened up opportunities, but at the same time, it's also, the pandemic has put a hit on our financial abilities as well, which is taken into big consideration of what we're able and not able to do. It's definitely been able to help us schedule projects where the funding wasn't as impacted. Like, we have a lot of maintenance projects that were able to go on sooner this year than later, and which allowed us time to expand some of the other maintenance projects and operation, helping with some of our other operations. But at the same time, we've had to take into consideration cuts of within our budget to accommodate some of those changes too. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple things. You hit on most of it. One of the challenges, these projects take so long to go through design and right-of-way acquisition that it's hard to just jump on something to take advantage of an opportunity when traffic's light, although it would be a great thing to be able to do that because, a couple things. One, if you have less traffic, your project will actually cost less because you're spending less money on temporary construction or traffic control. But then, like Stephen had mentioned, then during something like this, the budget takes a huge hit. I will say that the Southeast 43rd signal has been able to take advantage by just luck that it happened to go to construction right before the pandemic happened. And it's made things a lot easier having less traffic out there and allowed the project, I think, to move faster than it would have otherwise. But it's hard to do, although in a perfect world, I'd love to be able to have all of our major traffic impacts happen at a time like this when less people were out and about driving.
Thanks. Does that answer your question, Erica?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I wasn't even thinking about it from the budget being hit that angle as well, like staff reduction.
Yeah, it's helpful. Janie, and then after Janie will be Jerry.
No, I'm good. I'm just, absorbing everything, but it was good to see the kind of the thought process went behind creating the plan. Thank you.
Okay, this is Jerry. So I'm not real familiar with the priority plan that you developed last year or so. So I think it's going to take me a while to tie things in. So I'll probably have to sit back with that. But I was thinking, even though you do develop this priority plan, there'll be some projects that are like $500,000 versus maybe 2 million versus maybe 10 million. So is it the city employees who take our priority list and then they see what dollars are available and then they kind of develop the tip that way? Is that really what happens? Because we can prioritize projects, but they're going to be different design costs or construction costs, correct? And so to develop that tip, you need to be thinking about that too, right? So that's
Hey, I'll go ahead and add a little bit to answer what you're talking about, Jerry. One of the things that's on my to-do list between now and our next meeting is to look at the different projects that we have to program in there, like the mandated ones, annual ones, and ongoing ones. And even though I don't think I'll have a perfect crystal ball on how much money and capacity we have, I'd like to try and get a ballpark to be able to say, okay, this is what we originally had, but then once we look at all the things that we have to program in here, here's what we have left. Because I think it would be a waste of everyone on this board's time if you came up with this much projects and then I had to say, well, thanks for all that great work. Let's pick one. I think that would be frustrating for you guys, and I don't want to do that to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go with Joseph next and Christy after that. And Joseph, will you tell us if you prefer Joe or Joseph?
Yeah, I prefer Joseph. But I just had one really small question. I saw that on the transportation improvement plan, the biggest project was the I-90 crossing between 10th and 12th Avenue Northwest, but the starting year is 2021, and a lot of the project isn't until like in future years past 2023 and even further past that. I was just kind of curious, like when is it projected to be finished, or when is like projected completion year?
I'll go ahead and answer that one. The reason why it shows originally in 2021 was several tips ago. The plan was to do some planning work with the thought, and I can't remember the years exactly, but I think it was maybe do some planning work this year and next year, and then try and apply for a grant. But then, as we talked with the tab last year, there's a lot going on in that area between Sound Transit coming in. Our concurrency model says we need another crossing of I-90. There's now the priorities in the mobility master plan. And we decided not to start that project in that planning process because we wanted to get more of our ducks in a row. And so to answer your question, when it will be finished, I don't know. Although probably maybe the question that we need to work on the answer to is when will we start it? But a lot of that depends on external things like the timing of Sound Transit. What do we want for Gilman and the heart of central Issaquah? What do we want for this crossing? And so there's a lot of work and a lot of unknowns, and those we need to get figured out. Then we can come up with a plan of starting to do the detailed planning to work it out, to then try and get the funding to then go to design and construction. Did that answer your question, Joseph?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Christy, how about you?
I just have a newbie question. My question is, so with the TIP and then the rating, once that's done, the public, how does it account for public comment or going through the process to council adoption? I believe there's also a public hearing each year.
Go ahead, John. I think you know the schedule better than I do.
Sure. Yeah, so I want to say it's April 19th, it will be presented to council. And then council will hold their deliberations on the fourth Tuesday of April. I think that's the 27th. I don't have a calendar in front of me. And then the first Monday in May is when the public hearing will be held. And that's when the public can provide their comments. And then from there, a couple of different things can happen. The hearing could be continued for more public comments, or it could be closed. Council could meet on the first Tuesday of May and do some more deliberating, or they could choose not to. And then the goal is to approve it on May 17th. So the best opportunity for public comment would be at the hearing, which would be on the first Monday of May.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. And I know you went over the dates earlier. I guess I was just kind of in my brain thinking about the feedback loop. You know, once it got approved, if there was a substantive change, what does that look like, you know, as it comes back to tab and sort of as the TIP progresses. But I can wait as we kind of go through our future meetings. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. So the feedback that's received, that'll go back to council, but I don't anticipate it going back to the tab. That the feedback that they get at the hearing, then council can decide whether they want to make a revision and keep the hearing open, or if they want to close it and keep the tip as is.
And then one thing I'll add to John's response is this won't be the only time the tab will be looking at the tip. This will kind of be an annual thing. So we'll have an opportunity to always kind of make a recommendation to City Council what the tip will look like, even though we're kind of looking at it twice this year because of kind of the full range scope of changes that we're looking to make. The tab will be looking at the full TIP every year before it goes to City Council.
So my screen moved around, but let's go Micah, Sujata, Tom.
Hi, so I have two questions. One is definitely for, like, I guess, maybe John and Stephen. If we could see or where I would find the effect on the total cost of these different projects or even the yearly cost based on how things are prioritized, is that something we normally take into consideration? And if we can take that into consideration, how do we see those numbers?
Is your question on if we wait longer on projects that the costs will rise and how that impacts our priorities?
Yeah, I'm assuming for some projects it will be, very small change, and there might be some projects that there's a large impact to the cost to move them to a later date.
That's a good question, and it's a little bit of a guessing game because we're trying to guess a number of things. So if a project has right-of-way acquisition, we need to look at the cost of per square foot of land in Issaquah for different zonings. And obviously that's been going up really high. Another thing that we'll kind of have to look at that could impact the cost of our projects is the cost of transportation construction in this region has been growing at a really fast rate. And the reason for it is WashDOT has a lot of really large projects that they have underway, and Sound Transit does too, and so does the city of Seattle. And it's just a matter of contractor capacity has been really high, and so things have been going up at a really high rate. What I don't know is, as all the other agencies in the region start readjusting their budgets to the new outcome of COVID, what does that then do to these long-term large projects that are driving up the cost of construction? And so I guess to sum up, we'll probably just take an assumption and assume that construction costs are going to go up at a certain rate. But with where we're at, it's going to be just a pure guess because there's too many variables at this point.
Okay. And then my other question is about what exactly the TAB's responsibility or authority is. You know, we kind of talk about this discussion on the priority of projects, but I guess I'm not crystal clear on, are we actually, you know, are we supposed to come up with that list, that prioritization as a recommendation, right? Or are we more trying to figure out the guidance and how to apply that guidance that as laid out in like the mobility master plan, and then apply that and sort of frame it that way?
Sure, I can take that one. The best way you can see it is that the TAB is helping provide guidance on how we want to apply a lot of that criteria, but also giving staff feedback on how the criteria could look. Staff will do all kind of the hard work there in terms of taking the list, applying the criteria, and then bringing it back to the TAB just so you can see the results and give us further feedback on, okay, this is exactly what I want, or this is, you know, this is kind of what I was hoping to see. And staff will, you know, it'll basically be that cycle of staff does a lot of the work, comes to the TAB with a lot of the questions of, all right, does this or does this not meet kind of what you were looking for or what we're trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
And then try to produce the report, the results before TAB puts together kind of the recommendation going to City Council. And then staff will communicate a lot of that feedback and recommendation to City Council when we eventually meet with that.
Thanks, Stephen.
What about you, Sujata?
I'm good. I think I stated what I thought earlier.
Okay, how about you, Tom?
I'm good. I mean, I'm very familiar with CIPs and TAPs, having worked with them on the consulting side for years. So I understand how they mostly how they work. And kind of what I do now is I do something similar for the agency I work for now. I think my only question is if there's a priority or something that we want to go back and revisit it. I know we spent a lot of time putting those together, but if something's added to it, is there an opportunity to do it maybe every other year as opposed to every year? So we don't want to be changing criteria every year because then it's always changing. You want to have something set to kind of be able to judge and gauge things by over the years. But otherwise, I'm good. I don't have any other comments and questions. I'm still quite familiar with all this as well. So appreciate it. I think that's all. David Wagner had his hand up for a question also.
Hey, thanks. Just a quick question. John, I probably missed it, but, or on the annual projects and the mandated, are they in the budget annually for those figures?
The amount that gets put in can change. So for example, the pavement management program, we had I forget what we were programming in, and then for the 2020 budget, we cut most of it due to COVID cuts. And then in the 2021 budget, council ended up putting in extra money in order to try and close some of the gap on it. So the exact amount for the annual projects can change. Some of them are more set in, like, well, I guess any of them can always change, but like the small strategic capital project, I think it started out at 100,000, but then it had an inflation rate. And so then the next year it would be 105,000, or I don't know what it was, but they do change a little bit over time.
Thanks, but they are displayed in the budget, correct?
You said they're displayed in the budget?
Yes, they have like a line item.
Yes. Yeah, and actually all these projects, as Stephen mentioned earlier, because this is a planning document and not the actual budget, what happens when the budget gets put together is we'll take all the different items that we're planning to do in a year, and then they get a line item in the budget and then get put in there, the ones that are going to actually be done.
I might add one more comment about cost and then labor. It's very fluid, and especially if there's a lot of projects that are going on in Seattle, it's higher pay, higher rates, so they'll draw a lot more workers down there, and sometimes it's harder to get workers to do work in outlying areas or outlying cities. So the labor market can be very flexible, and Seattle might then go down, and then there's a flood of labor, and then things get a little bit cheaper. Contractors make up for when they're lean times, and make up a little bit higher prices when times get good. So it's very fluid as far as the cost of projects. And usually after a lean time, like in COVID, when a lot of construction was down initially, contractors will bid a lot more to try and make up for the profit that they lost. And so, in a good year, the costs will go up quite a bit, and that's where you get price increases and jumps. And I think so. So it is quite fluctuating.
Do we have any more questions or comments on this topic? Stephen, are you wanting to move on to, are we concluding that line item, agenda item, I should say, and moving on to?
Yes, yeah. If there's no other comments or questions, we can move on to the next item. We'll be back at the next meeting on February 4th to have a much more robust discussion of kind of the results of the criteria, how it was applied to the project list, and how everything kind of ranked, and then discuss a little bit more of, is this what we want? What else should we consider?
Okay, sounds like we're on to 5A. And we were way ahead of schedule, now we're right on schedule, but it was a good discussion. Thanks.
John, that's you with the work plan. I can pull that up if that helps.
Oh, yes. Actually, I was in the process of pulling it up and then trying to find WebEx to unmute myself so I could respond. Okay.
Go ahead.
Let's see here. Oops, hold on. Okay. Can you guys see the work plan? Okay. All right. So Stephen did a lot of the work to put this work plan together, and it's been in your packet. Hopefully you guys had a chance to look at it, but wanted to just have the opportunity to see if there's any questions or comments about the work plan.
One thing I'll add on kind of the board's work plan is this will regularly change every month as we kind of go through our agendas and make adjustments to kind of our schedule so that we're kind of accommodating the pace that the board needs on topics, but also adding topics to our schedule when necessary.
I have a question. I was wondering about the racial equity training, if you could tell us any more about that. And yeah, it says TBD. I guess I would say I want to make a pitch for making that happen because I think it'd be really useful.
Yes, I can kind of speak to the racial equity training. So one of the things, one major project that's kind of going on citywide is making sure that the city of Issaquah is a racially equitable and an inclusive community. And so staff is going through training and hiring a consultant to conduct a lot of that training. And one of the components that we're going to be included in the contract with the consultant is to be able to provide racial equity training to all our boards and commissions. Right now on the schedule, it's listed as TBD, just because I wanted to put it someplace in the schedule. It could happen in March or it could happen in April, which is why it's TBD. So that'll be finalized once we have further details, which we'll have a consultant on board hopefully by the end of this month. Were you wanting to know more about what the training might consist of?
I was actually just thinking that on our wish list, it would be nice to have some professional training on racial equity and social justice in regards to transportation specifically. And there's not a lot of literature out there, but there's probably some. And I think that it's not something you think about, but I think there's a lot of implications that we could be mindful of. And so it sounds like this is general and probably really valuable, but I think it would be nice if sometime in the next 6 to 18 months we could have a serious discussion about how it applies to transportation planning.
Okay, we'll take a look at trying to get that in as part of this process for racial equity training for staff. It's also to train staff to be able to talk about this and have our own internal type workshops. So that's something that we'll see if we can, where on the schedule that might be able to fit.
Hi, Stephen. This is Christy. One thing that I wanted to just share, I was in Economic Vitality Commission last night, where we heard an update on the potential signage code changes. And one of the questions that came up, and I think Jen Davis Hayes will connect, is having potentially the Transportation Advisory Board take a look at signage from a transportation perspective. So primarily around things like temporary signage, so A-frames, temporary signs, those kinds of things. So I thought I might share that.
Yeah, thanks. Good to know.
Thank you, Christy. I'll connect with Jen to get a little more information and figure out kind of timing on that.
Okay, I'll go ahead and stop sharing the work plan.
Stephen, do we have a staff report?
I have a quick one, if that's okay. So just to kind of give a quick update, the city is moving forward on the early implementation of the streetscape plan, which is to provide improvements on Alder in downtown Issaquah, and that is to convert it to a festival street. For those of you who aren't familiar with the streetscape plan, I'll send a link after today's meeting, and you can read through. But it encompasses a lot of improvements to go into downtown Issaquah, particularly on Front Street and Alder Street, to make it more of a pedestrian-friendly environment to support our downtown businesses. Another update is to follow up on kind of the complete streets policy. We're going to the February 9th study session for City Council to discuss the complete streets policy recommendations that came from the board last year, and then taking it to the March 15th City Council meeting for final approval. And that's going to kind of start a process for staff to start making updates to our street standards, which are other topics that we'll be bringing to the board this year on several occasions. If you're interested in learning more about transportation topics, February 9th is going to be kind of a full transportation themed study session. I'll send a follow-up and reminder with a link to how to access that study session. But we're going to be discussing transit system. We'll be discussing the mobility master plan, as well as the complete streets policies, as well as traffic calming and electric vehicle charging station policies related to that. John, am I missing anything from that study session?
I don't think so.
So again, I'll follow up with more information on that city council meeting in case you want to learn more about it or watch the city council meeting.
Sorry, I'm toggling back and forth between screens, and I'm wondering if, item 5C is chair report, and I do not have a chair report. And then the next one is the youth report. Do we have a youth report?
No.
And maybe I'll just ask Erica if she wants to make a comment, because I know that was something you were trying to weigh in on when we talked about it earlier. It sounds like that was something important to you, if you want to make some comments.
Yeah, I just think in the interest of like, looking through things through more of an equity lens. Since we have a youth member, Joseph, I'm so sorry I didn't reach out to you beforehand, so I don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but I just wanted to make sure that I noticed that was a aspect that could maybe go away. Maybe I was looking at like an old agenda or something. I just wanted to make sure that you had a chance to weigh in on that. I'm not a youth member, but I think one of the younger members. I just wanted to make sure that vital voice was being heard. If it, if it needs to, obviously, if you have nothing to report, then we'll move on.
Joseph, you mentioned that you were on other boards, so I want to echo Erica's sentiment that it's nice to, my kids are grown and moved away, so I'm not very connected to the youth in this community like I used to be, and I think it does have implications to everything we do, so I wouldn't want to create extra work on your probably already busy schedule, but I would encourage you to share things you think that this wide range of people on this board would benefit from hearing. So, and I guess it'd be Alec, and I just looked at the roster. Do we still have Alec? Oh, we lost Alec.
He had to drop off halfway through the meeting.
Ah, got it. Okay. So it sounds like Alec and Joseph are youth members. Is that correct? Okay. Again, I don't want to put a lot of pressure, and you probably already have lots and lots to do, but we want to make sure that opportunity is there.
Yeah, actually, so I'm on the Issaquah Youth Advisory Board, so I can probably reach out to them and see if they have any comments for transportation related projects. I was actually in a meeting with them, I think a week ago or a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about, I think, proposals to the city of Issaquah for I think it was the comprehensive plan, and one idea that I suggested was creating after school transportation for youth, so that it would be more convenient for 9-to-5 working parents to pick up their kids from public school. But yeah, I guess aside from that, I don't have any comments for now.
Do we have any other business or announcements?
Madam Chair, David Wagoner. Under that topic, what I'm used to, and I don't know if this fits, but that's usually where the good of the order is. Is that the same thing that we're looking at as other business announcements or good of the order?
I don't think we actually have done that in the past, but I am not opposed to it. I know it's 7:59. I'm pretty committed to finishing on time, but I do think it's nice for this board to get to know each other a little bit. So maybe I don't know, David, do you have something specific? Because if you have something specific for good of the order, I'd love to hear it.
No, being on other boards, good of the order is where announcements for the good of the order usually come in. So that's all I was trying to point out.
It's part of the Robert's Rules of Orders, it's the order of it. So,
That's correct. That's correct. It's Robert's Rules of Order.
Do we have anything for the good of the order tonight?
I got one thing. I get my shot tomorrow at 10:45 in the morning.
round
Oh,
one.
nice, nice.
Congratulations.
Hey, I do have one thing. I note one of the things that I miss, one of the many things I miss about having to be online instead of in person is the before and the after the meetings. So I think I probably was on for 3 minutes beforehand, but I'll try to make an effort to get on a couple minutes early. Stephen, is there any reason we can't get in the habit of jumping on 10 minutes early and just chit chat?
I'm usually starting the meeting about a half hour early, so anyone who wants to get on and kind of talk with everyone, feel free.
Can I
I might
ask
forget. It'd be kind of a nice thing for us to get to know each other a little bit. I am also pretty committed to starting on time. I'm not a big fan of rewarding late people by waiting for them, unless, of course, we don't have a quorum. It's just sort of a core value of mine. So I will try to start on time. Well, if there's nothing else, I think one of my roles is to close the meeting. Do we need to do that by motion or do we just close? Okay. Well, I suggest that at 8:01 we adjourn this meeting. Any objections? Thanks all. Thanks, Steve.
Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
John. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Right.